Before we get started with this episode, let me point out the obvious. It's the gift-giving season. But what isn't so obvious is that you can get your gifts and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner, and whatever you get during that visit, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So get your Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, and Festivus gifts through our Amazon associate links. It's a smart way to shop, and you'll be helping out the show. So let's get started with this thing.
Here comes Santa Claus, right down Santa Claus Way.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Conor Stechschulte. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sterg, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Sterg and I have the pleasure of talking with Conor Stechschulte. He has a series, Generous Bosom, the third part of which came out in the spring. And we talk with Conor about this narrative and everything that went into its creation. It's a great conversation. But before we get to that, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. And the December bundles just went up, so there's a Valiant bundle for 50% off. There's a Jinx World bundle for 50% off. And if you want, you can order a copy of The Amateurs, an earlier work by Conor Stechschulte, for 35% off.
That's right. It's a great way to get your comics and to introduce yourself to the work of Conor Stechschulte at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
And we sent you with velocity. How's that?
Yeah. Well, Sterg, this was a really interesting interview, and I have been a fan of Stechschulte's work for a while. And in fact, on previous episodes, we have reviewed some of his work. I know that I think Gene and I discussed The Amateurs when it first came out from Fantagraphics a few years ago. And then in early 2015, when Generous Bosom Part 1 came out, Andy and I discussed that on a review show. And then just recently, a few months ago, I got in touch with Conor about the third part of Generous Bosom, and because I didn't have a copy and I didn't even know about it, and I think I just stumbled across information about it, and I asked him if he wanted to be on the show and talk about this series, and he agreed. And this was a really nice conversation.
Yeah, I agree. His work I was unfamiliar with it until I read it before the interview, and I have to say, Generous Bosom really blew me away and perplexed me, and it was a very good read. So I'm looking forward to book 4. I'm also looking forward to our interview.
Yeah, and we should also mention that I think a selection of Part 2 was included in the 2017 volume of Best American Comics.
That's right. He did mention that.
Yeah. So anyway, as you mentioned, it was a great interview. Let's go ahead and listen to that now.
Sounds great.
We're very pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Conor Stechschulte. The third part of his Generous Bosom series came out in spring of this year. Conor, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you, Conor.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, I wanted to start off because for me, I know that on the podcast in the past, people have reviewed the Generous Bosom, the prior entries in this series. For me, I'm new to your work with this series, and one of the things that occurred to me is that it kind of went a lot of different places that I didn't expect. And I'm wondering, what was your inspiration for creating this series in the first place?
Yeah, it always comes from like a number of different angles, you know, what come together to make it necessary or fun or interesting to make a book. So I think I was trying to remember recently, like when and where the first couple of ideas happened. What I think actually the initial idea came when I went on a long distance bike trip right after I finished undergrad. And I remember thinking about, because it was sort of along this established cross-country bike route. And I was like, oh yeah, if somebody wanted to trap a cyclist, it'd be really easy. They could just sort of, you know, set out some sharp objects on the road, and most likely they would stop at whatever house was closest. And I remember just sort of thinking that and being like, oh yeah, that's kind of weird. And then not doing anything with it for that thought for like several years. And then I remember I sort of sketched the first couple pages of the first comic while on another sort of cross-country trip with my band about 3 years later. And so, yeah, I think there's something about traveling across country or being on like a long trip that kind of fed into at least the initial spark. And then and then I don't know, the subsequent twists or turns or whatever kind of occurred as I began working on it.
Yeah, it occurs to me it's a great setup for a horror movie, or for a horror comic, actually. Like,
yeah.
Well, at one point, one of the characters, I think it may have been in the second part of Generous Bosom, says something about Kathy Bates.
Yeah. I think that's like at the end of the first one. Yeah, I was sort of that was sort of like one of the abandoned paths that I thought that maybe the story might turn into, sort of like, you know, Glenn being trapped in that house sort of perpetually. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask just something very briefly, and then we can move on or move back to your book. But you mentioned that you were in a band. Are you currently in a band?
Yeah. I'm in a band called Lilac, actually with another amazing cartoonist, Anya Davidson, is also in the band.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And my friend Chris Day, who was in my previous band, is also like, he was part of like the closed caption comics group that I sort of came up in comics with. He doesn't do a whole lot of comics any longer, but he still does like drawing and zines and posters and stuff. And and our friend Kenny Rasmussen from here in Chicago. But yeah, we've been playing together for like a little over 2 years now. Yeah.
Sweet. Does Anya use your exploits for her Band for Life comics? Just curious.
Well, she's not currently working on Band for Life, but maybe we're sort of like filling the tank for a reboot eventually.
Gotcha.
Well, getting back to Generous Bosom, one of the things that I noticed is, at least with these three parts that we have so far, and I believe, the first one came out was it 2015?
I think it was like the latter. It was like right at the end of 2014.
And then 2 came out, was it 2015 or 16?
It was like, again, like the end of 2015.
Okay.
It was like, I think both of those came out. The two came out like sort of. I think I debuted them at consecutive Comic Arts Brooklyn festivals.
Okay. And then we had the third one come out this year. It seems to me that with each successive part of this narrative, things become more complex. You introduce more moving parts. So, for instance, in the first Generous Bosom, and this is something that Sturge and I were actually talking about yesterday, it seems, with maybe one exception, kind of a straightforward storyline. It's easy to follow. You have one narrative thread. You have Glenn, who is in this predicament that you just described, right? He's trapped. He's in a house. And the people who are at the house have certain things that they're planning, but you don't exactly know what those are. Kind of creepy. There's one exception, though, to Generous Bosom 1 in that there is a section, I don't know if it's about in the middle or
I think
after.
it's like, are you talking about like the sort of interruption?
Yes, with Shannon.
Yeah, it's like,
with Shannon.
Yeah, it's like exactly at the middle.
Oh, interestingly enough, and appropriately enough. And so you're wondering, what's this about? But then we're thrown back into the story. So I don't know, at least the first time that I read this, I remember I didn't really think much about that section because in Generous Bosom 1, you're already overlapping, sometimes literally, visually speaking, stories or story spaces, which I think is a really wonderful way to tell your narrative. So I really didn't think much of that. Then we get to Generous Bosom 2, and we get quite a bit more of Shannon. And so that kind of makes sense in terms of kind of a callback to what you alluded to in the first one. But then there are other parts or potential storylines that are going on, or at least offshoots of your main storyline. We're not sure yet. Then with 3, there's even more, I don't want to say complication, but more twists that by the time that I got to the end of the third one, I have to tell you, I don't know what to expect.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that's a good thing.
That sort of sense of having kind of like your expectations or thwarted or confused enough to where you're put in a state of like not knowing what's going to happen is like one of my favorite things to get from art.
Well, you're good at it.
It gets harder and harder, the more movies and books and, TV shows that you take in to like actually be like, I really have no clue what's going to happen. So I hope that, that's what I'm sort of aspiring to, because that's what I look for in a reading experience. But yeah, I think like that first like initial hint, like I think I had the idea for the first volume, and it is a sort of like complete self-contained story. But as I was working on it, I saw the ways that it was going to expand, and so I wanted to sort of drop a little piece of that into the book to kind of hint at the larger world that I wanted to get at.
Hey, Conor, the question I have that comes from what you've been talking, you're talking about surprising reading experiences, and then you kind of talked about that the Kathy Bates kind of misery thread that maybe you were going to follow or not.
Yeah.
Is it a surprising writing experience for you, your work on this series?
Yeah, the writing experience of it has been pretty like varied throughout. I'd say like the first 2 volumes were done in much the same way, where I was sort of like collecting notes about the larger story and would sort of usually had like 4 or 5 pages in a sketchbook that kind of outlined where I thought the book was going to go. And then I would kind of plan, sort of do like plan pages about like 10 to 15 pages at most ahead of myself in terms of the drawing of the book. And then after the second volume, I kind of I knew all these places I wanted to go to, but I didn't. I knew in some places like how to get there, but I was like, I need to like kind of get a feeling for this whole story as one thing, rather than kind of proceeding like with the sort of singular building blocks of it or something. So I did like between 2 and 3, I've written out the whole story, like kind of scripted it. And I'm now like working from that, but still only have like, the actual pages planned out about, 10 to 15 pages ahead of myself. But I have a plan all the way to the end. But I've been really trying to not be too hemmed in with the script, like to add and subtract and to make changes in response to how I'm feeling about where the story actually is, on the actual pages that I'm making. You know what I mean?
Gotcha.
That's curious because I was wondering, given your comment about how you like to keep the reader guessing and to surprise the reader occasionally, if in the writing process you find that you surprise yourself in terms of what you come up with. In other words, there's a particular turn that you take or your narrative takes that you didn't anticipate, and you go, I didn't know that would happen, within the mists of creating the story.
Yeah, I think those moments have sort of happened. I think when I've sort of painted myself into a corner or something that I didn't know how to get out of, and you have to like kind of come up with another kind of logical solution to stitch things together to make them actually make sense or something. That's been a really fun part about the putting together of this sort of like larger narrative. And also I think like what the scripting allowed me to do was to try out a lot of really different stuff and scrap it or, decide I wanted to keep it. So I can't think of necessarily like a particular turn where I was like, oh wow. But I think for sure, like just in sort of like the problem solving process of trying to make a plot like hang together, you wind up having to do things that you didn't anticipate.
Yeah. Hey, Conor, now that you know kind of how it's plotted out in a grand scheme, even if you don't know all the specific parts, how many books do you think is this story gonna entail?
I'm trying to wrap up the main narrative in the next book, but I think it's going to be the longest book so far. I'm guessing it's going to be around 100 pages, and I'm hoping to get all the way to the end. But I think like at least before I started the third volume, I was like, yeah, I think this is the last one. And then I got working on it, and I was like, oh yeah, no way. But so far, I still believe this will be the last one.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I know. Given what we see at the tail end of the second book, and then you explore more fully in the third, I would have just anticipated that this is a series that would go on for at least 2 or 3 more.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe it might end up being the equivalent of that in like page count, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll see. I do keep having ideas beyond what I have planned, and whether or not that'll actually be the best idea to like continue with or not. I guess I'll decide once I get there.
So do you plan, once you're completed with the entire story, do you plan on collecting everything in one volume?
Yeah, I would definitely like to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's sort of ideas I have too for like little additions and little changes that I'd like to do to release the story in that format. I think there are a couple things that it'd be good to kind of like, there's a couple like pieces that I think could be like better better connected or something. that I think, I'm really looking forward to the opportunity of like putting it all in one volume.
Conor, one of the things I noticed just flipping through it and reading through the coloring choices that you have. I mean, there's a lot of, green and purples, and some places you get very kind of not detailed, but very elaborate with the cross hatching and use multiple colors. Other places you kind of alternate it with more, negative space, maybe something like that, less shading. What are your choices for how you color what and how you kind of do things that way?
Yeah, so I think like the coloring choices are to sort of track like sort of distinct stories, or maybe in some cases like one character's perspective, like when we're kind of following or like kind of inside a character's worldview. Gotcha. I like to sort of code that using a color. Although as I get to the end, I'll have to make some decisions as to like how to carry that through, because I don't want it to be like too didactic. Like, oh, this is the real world, and this is someone's, that sort of thing. But right. I'd like to complicate that sort of reading of it or something. And in terms of like the level of, I try to just sort of think about what is important, and if like the lighting or atmosphere in a given scene is important, then I'll include that. But if it's just like people talking in a well lit room, I won't waste a lot of time
right
putting in the lighting conditions, because I want it to be a sort of like stark fluorescent lit kind of setting.
Because that's one of the things that struck me, and I mean this in a good way. I mean, your books were ones I had to read 2 or 3 times, not in a, not like laboriously, like, oh man, I got to read them again. But it was kind of like rewarding, because I was like, okay, the first time I'm just trying to kind of figure out what's going on, and I'm like, there's a whole lot that doesn't make sense. And then going through, I kind of had to, try to figure out, okay, he's making choices about what's colored what way and what world is what world. And there's definitely some dreamlike places. So I just want to say that, I very much appreciated your various choices, and I found them confusing and complex, but in a good way.
Oh, cool. Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah. That's something I really love about comics. I think they sort of suit the way I like to read, because I tend to kind of like read stuff. I think kind of like I'm not like a super deep reader on a first pass through a novel or a comic, but just like the way the sort of density, it's like high speed but high density in terms of information that the comics are capable of. Like you can blast through something, but then take another moment back through, and it's really easy to kind of be selective about like what pieces you need to complete your picture of the story, in the way that like it would be super frustrating to like rewind through a movie, and rewatch scenes, but like you can kind of just drop right back in by opening the pages of a book. That's something I really love about comics.
Yeah, and I found myself doing that with Generous Bosom. I was flipping to like specific parts, and I was like, but was that, I'm trying to like make sense of things, and but she said this and he said that, and oh my, and is that art? Whose art? Which one? Yeah. So I like how you're messing with me.
Okay, good.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I guess along with the color choices is that your storytelling style in Generous Bosom is quite elaborative and I think experimental in certain places. And it's now, granted, it's been a long time since I've read The Amateurs, but I don't remember the same kind of storytelling emphasis in that narrative as I see in Generous Bosom. So I'm wondering if what you're doing in Generous Bosom is, the normal Conor Stechschulte, and what we saw with The Amateurs a few years ago was a departure.
Well, I mean, I think that both projects they sort of were outgrowths of who I was at those times and what I was capable of, and also what I thought I was capable of in terms of storytelling. Yeah, I mean, I think the Amateurs was meant to be a pretty like straight ahead. It's like it takes place like in one day, basically, with a couple other like sort of insertions of like a kind of outside story. But it was those kind of moments of kind of putting two separate but related stories like in tension with one another that I was like trying out with the Amateurs that was super exciting to me, that I wanted to kind of do again or explore more fully with Generous Bosom.
Now, I know that Fantagraphics published the Amateurs in 2014, but you had a self-published version of it, which I have not seen. And I'm curious what differences, if any or many, there may be between your self-published Amateurs and that we saw from Fantagraphics.
Yeah, there's like a whole nother frame, like the framing story of the young girl with like her diary at the all girls school that was added in the Fantagraphics version.
Okay.
I had a different sort of very brief kind of like letter, like handwritten thing that kind of did a similar thing with the introduction about like, cause I had the idea of like the head washing up on shore and talking, in the original book. But yeah, I added that whole sort of secondary or like framing story, in the Fantagraphics version. I also, re-lettered most of the book because I went back and was like horrified by my lettering.
Conor, talking about self-publishing versus Fantagraphics, one of the things that occurs to me is that the press that's publishing Generous Bosom, the Generous Bosom books, is Breakdown Press, which is in Europe. And what's it like, kind of working cross-continental that way? Is there a big difference?
It's not, it's not as crazy as you might imagine with that level of distance. They're super, super lovely people. And usually, I guess with the exception of the third book, we've kind of been able to sync up to release the books at shows where we've both myself and some form of Breakdown Press has been present. So it hasn't felt that, disconnected or anything. Mm-hmm. There is like that moment of trepidation where you send your files away and you're like, oh man, I hope this comes back all right. But, yeah, Joe always oversees the printing, and, I trust him deeply. Cool.
Well, I'm curious how you got connected with Breakdown Press.
It was really through repeated hangouts at the Comic Arts Brooklyn festival, and I guess in its earlier iteration as the Brooklyn Comics and Graphics Festival. I'm trying to remember the exact sequence. I met Joe Kessler and Simon Hacking, I think at the same time. I maybe met Joe first. I think Joe was over here. He has family in New York, and he was like, I think babysitting. He was like a live-in nanny for like a couple months, a couple years back, and that overlapped with the time with the comic festival. And so we just met and hung out, and he's a hilarious and lovely dude to hang with. And we just like, man, that guy's awesome. And then he came back the next year. I think it was the next year, or it might've been, I'm trying to remember, because he and Simon worked for Nobrow. So, I would see them at. I know I saw Simon at like TCAF, maybe like the following TCAF or something, and then the year after that, like they showed up having. I think this would have been 2013, having published Window Pane 1, and I lost my mind looking at that. It's like I was so inspired and. It was like, oh man, this is like the vision of what I want to do, and I think comics should be. And so they were like, yeah, would you want to do a book together? And I was like, yes. And at that point, I had already started Generous Bosom. I'm like, I'm working on a book right now. We should do it. And yeah, it was kind of that simple.
Because I was curious, because I think that Breakdown Press is absolutely fabulous. I really love what they do, especially in terms of some of the alternative manga that they bring to English-speaking audiences. In fact, we have looked at a number of their books on our monthly manga series. But at the same time, I'm wondering, for a creator who, had been living in Baltimore, now is living in Chicago, do you find, because I don't know what kind of distribution Breakdown Press has in the United States, do you feel that, at least for North American readers, it's a little more difficult for people to find your work, except maybe by visiting your website or at shows?
Yeah, I mean, maybe so. I also feel like, in terms of like wanting to serialize work, or like just wanting to work on a project of this size and still kind of participate in the comics world, and still be like, because I could just sort of like hole up for whatever, it's like 6 years or something it's taken me to work on this book, and then wait to release it all as one thing. I think I'd with my temperament and what I like about comics and being in the sort of comics and self-publishing world, I like to be a more active and sort of constant participant in that. So it's really suited me really well to work with them in this way, because it's allowed me to serialize this story and not I guess not be sort of like disconnected from the world of the shows and stuff like that.
So you think you're going to stick with Breakdown when you do a 1-volume collection, the complete Generous Bosom?
Well, I'm thinking I've talked a little bit with Fanta about doing the final collection.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're publisher of The Amateurs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. A complete Generous Bosom sounds like a different thing. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll follow up with that. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction with that too. One of your comments earlier about, kind of trying to craft a story today when there's so many different types of stories out there, so many different ways that, different genres and different things, and kind of leads me to ask, what are the things that are you into? Not necessarily things maybe that were inspirations or things that you're thinking about maybe in the back of your head with Generous Bosom, but what kind of things are you into that might be creeping into your work or affecting your work, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, you just generally, like, what am I most into, or what?
Yeah. like maybe TV shows or things like, I don't know what, the last time I participated in an interview, it was with Tilly Walden, and she talked about kind of how she didn't read comics so much, but she found a lot of inspirations in TV shows and video games and things like that. And I'm wondering if, those kinds of narratives out there. And she talked about different genres, and I was wondering if you use things that aren't comics to kind of affect your comics work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that I probably read way more like fiction than comics.
Gotcha.
I do try to read a lot of comics and stay connected in that way. But I think the majority of my reading habits are fiction, mostly like novels. And so, yeah, there's been I would say like that has had a huge influence on the book as I've gone along. I think in the initial spark and like part of the idea, sort of formally in putting in making Generous Bosom was this idea that like, I think I was watching serial television, both good and bad, and kind of observing the kind of the way through sort of linked questions and cliffhangers and this type of stuff that you can be brought along in a story. In particular, I was thinking, like, I think that having the experience of reading like a book like the Da Vinci Code or something, where it's just like, it's actually like so dumb, but you're just like, oh my God, I got it. Like, what is it? What is it? And you just keep reading it. And then I got to, you get to the end of that book and you're like, what the fuck did I just do? Like, that was so dumb. But, and yeah, having that experience watching a couple TV shows as well and being just like, man, I fucking hate this show, but like, yes, next episode. I sort of thought about that. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, what if instead of like kind of propelling you into kind of like these kind of like asinine cliched scenarios, what if I were trying to, hopefully use the sort of thriller framework to take the story into like really weird places, kind of the places that I've accessed through sort of, strange books and things like that. Like, definitely like an author who had a huge effect, has had a huge effect on me and had a huge effect on this project is Kobo Abe. He wrote like The Woman in the Dunes, but I think I was thinking in particular about this book, Secret Rendezvous, that he wrote. That's like about a guy whose wife gets sort of kidnapped, like in an ambulance, like they just show up and take her. And then he spends the rest of the novel kind of exploring this like sprawling hospital and going over these, the whole hospital is like wired to be recorded. And so he's like going over all these, tapes and trying to find his wife. Yeah, that was a big influence. I think I answered that. I kind of took a. Oh
no, I think you did. I think you did.
Yeah, what you just described makes a lot of sense given the third part of Generous Bosom.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that kind of strikes me reading this too. The whole series is that each book is kind of its own thing, and there's a part of me that almost thinks like they're not completely different genres, but it's like I don't watch the show American Horror Story, but I know what it does. And it strikes me that, like each one of these books is different and you ramp things up through each one and you add different elements through each one. And there's a part of me that thinks like I was curious about, like, do you just get like an inspiration about something and you just kind of dare yourself, like, I can do that kind of story now? Because at the end of Generous Bosom 3, the last page definitely it's leading in a different way, I think, from the image, the final image of the book. So you see a thing and I'm like, oh, this book started like a small kind of like weird psychological thriller, psychosexual thriller. I'll do that. But then at the end, I'm like, is this going, like into politics and then going to do some other weird thing where, it's like, it just kind of starts small, but kind of blows up through the series of, scope and context throughout the books. So like book 4 will be, I don't know, some kind of, book 5, if the fictional book 5 that you may never do, that you said, it would be like some kind of weird international thriller.
Yeah, maybe so. I didn't necessarily think about like trying to make each book a different genre, but I definitely did think about sort of this idea of like zooming out and out and out from the sort of like very small, like, you know, a small intimate space in the beginning, and sort of tracking implications or consequences, you know, in a widening radius.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, you know, as we discussed earlier, it seems that Generous Bosom 2 is significantly different from Generous Bosom 1 in certain ways, and that Generous Bosom 3 is different from what had come before, which leads me to this next question. I know that Generous Bosom 2 was, or at least a section of that, was included in last year's Best American Comics volume. So first and foremost, congratulations for that.
Thank you so much.
And it's interesting what they chose to excerpt. I remember when I read it, and this is before I read Generous Bosom 2, I thought, that's not the Generous Bosom that I remember from reading a couple of years ago. It just seemed very different. And so I was curious about their choice of excerpting, or was that something, I mean, did they consult you on what to excerpt?
They did not. No, they just got in touch and said, you know, we're interested in reprinting like this section. And it came at a really interesting time too, because I was like, I would say it came pretty much like at the exact moment I was feeling most like weird about those scenes. I was like, why did I put these in this book? I'm not sure if these fit. And then, or just sort of struggling going forward with how, like, I knew the initial sort of like, the section is sort of like a flashback to there's a bunch of flashbacks in volume 2 that go back to like the two, female characters, like teen years, basically, and sort of like difficult or sort of like formative experiences there. And I knew that, like, it was sort of like an intuitive choice to include those. And as I went forward with sort of like the plotting of this sort of larger narrative, I wasn't sure how those fit in a sort of like plot mechanical kind of way. Now I feel like I'm glad they're there, and I know what purpose they serve. But yeah, it was sort of an interesting moment to be like, oh, like, I don't know why these are even in the book. And then I was like, oh man, and now this will be like, you know, the way by which many people will be first introduced to the book. But I'm happy about it. It's sort of like the weirdest section of any of the books at present, you know, because it's sort of this jumbled memory of one of the characters, kind of like, confusing it with fiction, and a character who's sort of confusing their memories with fiction and with actual events.
Well, how did you find out about the inclusion?
I got an email.
Okay. I didn't know how official they were in terms of like a phone call or an email or anything like that.
Yeah, I wish I got a phone call. No. No, I got a really nice email, and it was, I'm super, super grateful.
Was it directly from Bill?
It was from Bill. Yeah. And I mean, but Ben Ketcher, who was the editor of that volume, has been like super awesome throughout the years. Like, he had me come and speak at his New York Comics and Picture Stories Symposium years ago. I think it was like sort of shortly after The Amateurs came out. He had me come out and talk about that, and it's just, he's an awesome, amazing artist and a great supporter of cartoonists far and wide. He's amazing. And that volume is so awesome. I feel like, I don't know, I think some people, from what I've gathered, some people didn't like it, but I mean, like, his introductory materials, Matt Thurber's cover, I thought all of that stuff was just incredible. Like, just really making that what could just be a sort of routine kind of anthology or something into like an actual kind of artistic book, you know.
I agree. I think
I'm really proud to be a part of it.
I think that volume was the most ambitious of any of them.
Yeah.
And that's not to say anything negative about the previous volumes. I think those were good. Those I really enjoyed them. It's just that Ben took it in a slightly different direction, and I think that's what may have put off some readers, but it's what excited me.
Who were just looking for like a survey or something.
Yeah. And it's and it's not a survey.
But and that's one of the things that kind of strikes me too about your work. And I'm wondering, when you talk to people or people talk to you about it, do they, I'm not going to say complain, but, you know, sometimes when comics are complex, people don't, you know, like they don't respond well to that because they're like, oh, I don't want to read it again. Like, you know, they kind of just want to read it and get it.
Yeah.
Do you get blowback like that, or?
A little bit. I think, let's see. I mean, in terms of my interactions with like comics people, I think the people who don't like the books outside of like, you know, reading a Goodreads review or something of your own work,
right.
The people who choose to interact with you are usually really nice. So maybe I'm just not hearing, although I came out to Chicago to go to grad school at the Art Institute. And so, yeah, over the course of making the third volume of the book, I was in an MFA program. And so parts of that book and previous books, I, you know, brought into panel critiques and stuff like that. So I did get some funny, frustrating comments from people in those settings, for sure. But those are people who were like, you know, in that context, in a way, kind of like forced to encounter the work. You know, they were assigned to me for a crit panel or something like that. So I think the people who, hopefully the people who are reading it are doing so voluntarily and stopping if it's like a frustrating experience for them. But yeah, I've gotten some funny. Yeah, I had a woman on a critique panel just be like, it's a comic. It's not supposed to be hard to read, which I thought was insane. Like in an art institution to be like, this should be easy,
right? Art should not challenge you.
Yeah, it was quite literally, pretty much said like those exact, like, this shouldn't be that hard, and it was a different comic, and it wasn't even as complex as Generous Bosom. It was just, yeah.
Yeah, well, she harbors a more traditional understanding. I think the wider public harbors the same, that, you know, comics should be easily accessible, and that's what makes them comics.
Yeah, it's a really funny thing too. Like in experiencing that in the context of an art institution, where presumably where presumably people are encountering visual art of whatever type. I mean, I think especially at SAIC is sort of like sells itself as being like a really interdisciplinary institution. I think it would be really hard to like go to any kind of presentation about SAIC where they're advertising themselves and not hear the word interdisciplinary at some point. It's a fun drinking game if you are into that. But then, like, in actual fact, like, especially I feel like, and maybe this is just, you know, coming from my own experience, but I think, you know, that's true up to a point. But like, if you try to show, like, God forbid you try and show like a painting professor a comic, they're just like, what is this? And you're like, yeah, it doesn't seem like it's that far outside of the purview. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot of really interesting, strange preconceptions about comics in the sort of like wider art context, it's like both that they're like more accessible, and like I think there's also a perception among like artists of like other disciplines that like comics make a lot of money too. Like I think like maybe like whatever like discipline you're in the arts, you always think like some other discipline is making more money. Although maybe I guess like when you hear people talk about art, they're like, yeah, it's not like you're a poet or something. I guess like poetry is the one that like everyone knows like doesn't make any money. But I think like if you're a painter and you're just like struggling to like have a show somewhere or something, and you see somebody who's able to just like sell their work directly to somebody, they're like, oh, this person must be making a lot of money. And so I think that kind of colors interpretations. I don't know. Yeah, I think there's a really strange, unpredictable melange of preconceptions when people encounter comics who aren't used to reading comics, I guess.
Well, in addition to going to conventions and also your website, I mean, in what ways do you get the word out about your comics? In other words, how are people exposed to them?
Yeah. I mean, I think kind and wonderful individuals such as yourself, like people who are willing to take the time to think and talk about them, hopefully that's one way. I do the Instagram thing. I don't know if that has a good effect or not. I think it does in some cases. Any way I can. Yeah.
Well, what cons do you usually frequent? You've told us a couple.
Right.
Yeah, I tend to go to maybe like the ones that are more geared towards small press. I haven't been to a lot of like the larger ones. The ones I usually go to in a given year will be like CAB, the Comic Arts Brooklyn Festival, TCAF, and Cake are the ones that like I pretty routinely go to. I have yet to miss a year of Cake. I've gone every single year. And also, now I'm actually one of the organizers of the Chicago Art Book Fair, which is happening soon. So, that's, I guess, like a comics adjacent activity that I do.
I've yet to go to Cake.
Yeah,
oh yeah, it's great.
And because what time of the year does it take place?
It's usually like the first weekend in June or the last weekend in May.
That's why I don't go, because it's the same. Yeah. It's around the same time as Heroes Con.
Ah, yeah.
And both Sturge and I attend that on a regular basis.
Yeah,
it's true.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I got my start, having gone to undergrad in Baltimore. The first show I ever went to was SPX, and that was the first show that I tabled at. That was definitely a formative show for me, though I think I went in 2014, but I haven't gone since then.
See, I've never been at all. And I used to live in Baltimore too, so I need to get myself.
You were even in Federal Hill. You were
That's right.
really close. Hop right on 95 there.
That's right. I was highfalutin there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great con.
Yeah. It's super interesting. Yeah, it's super interesting too. Like, because I mean, I started going there in like I think maybe 2006 was like the first year that I tabled there with my friends. It's been really interesting to just watch how the landscape has changed and the different people involved. It's been really interesting.
Mm-hmm. So you told us that you're currently working on Generous Bosom Part 4.
Yes.
Are there any other projects that you may be working on right now, or does Generous Bosom really take up all of your time?
Yeah, I wish, in my mind, the cartoonist that I want to be would be somebody who's able to like be working on several things at once, but I tend to have to like stop and start a given thing to sort of focus solely on one thing. So I did a short comic for the next Cold Cube Press anthology. They're like a risograph press from Seattle that do amazing work, and they're really incredible printers. That's coming out like the sort of fall festival season. I think they're debuting that at Short Run, and then they're doing Cab and coming out here for the Chicago Art Book Fair. And I have a page in the most recent Colorama Clubhouse book that's an incredible risograph publisher from Berlin. They do like this really amazing. They have this sort of really amazing like collaborative book format that they have done for a couple of years now. So I have a page in that.
Colorama Clubhouse?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The press is called Colorama, and so they do like, they call them like a clubhouse. I think it's like the Clubhouse Week is like the thing they do like once a year, but they do a Colorama Clubhouse every month, I think, with like 5 or so artists. But the format is they ask a group of artists to send them a single image, and then they have a second group of artists that then responds to those single images by making an extended comic.
Wow.
And so it's really cool. Like, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go out because they have like a whole week where they like hang. It's like a sort of like a residency where they hang out and make the comics together. I'd love to go out for that sometime. But yeah, it's really cool to like send your work away and then see somebody's response to it. and also like Johanna Mayersky, who's the publisher, is like just an unbelievable printer. If you can get your hands on that book, it's like unreal.
I'm going to ask this because I'm just ignorant of things.
Yeah.
How do you just get these international connections? It's just fascinating to me how you kind of, you're doing work, you're in Baltimore, you're in Chicago, and then, you got something in Berlin, you got something in London, you got something, how is it just you run into people at cons and it just works that way?
That's pretty much it. Although it's funny, like, the way, especially like in art or, comic, I mean, I think like, across disciplines, like how small the world is like really amazing because, for instance, Johanna, I met for the first, I was aware of Colorama, for a couple of years and had been seeing their amazing work. But I met Johanna last year when she came to the Chicago Art Book Fair, and she did like a visiting artist gig at my class at SAIC, which was amazing. And then our tables were right next to one another, so we were just like hanging out and cracking jokes all weekend. And she's hilarious, and so we had a just sort of personal connection. And then, but then she's like best friends with Aisha Franz, who's a German cartoonist, and my dear friend Nick Hood, who we used to be roommates in Baltimore, moved to Berlin several years ago and married Aisha. So there's sort of like, this web of connections through art and roommates and friends that start to develop. Yeah.
It's networking. It's all behind the scenes networking.
And,
that's what I like to do. I like to go to conventions and I just network my ass off.
Yeah. Okay. No pressures here, but when might we expect part 4 of Generous Bosom?
I'm aiming for next year sometime. It's going pretty good right now. I'm at about page 40. So I'm aiming for next year sometime. But I tried to impose some real like hard deadlines for myself for the third book and wound up just like blowing right past them and causing myself all sorts of unnecessary self-flagellation for that. So I'm trying to just, give it the time it needs, and hopefully sometime next year, maybe early 2020 at the latest. But it's going pretty good at this point, knock on wood. So yeah, I'm hoping to have it done maybe by the summer or something. So maybe it could come out in the fall. Maybe, I don't know.
And before we go, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sturge.
No, I was wondering the same thing, but I'm glad you asked because I didn't want to put pressure because you said it was probably going to be double size. I was like, well, are you going to keep the same rate going, or
trying?
Yeah.
Hey, that's it.
And before we go, I have to ask this question: Why the title "Generous Bosom"?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. No, I mean, it was sort of like an intuitive decision. I feel like it was a really. I tend to have if I have a title, I tend to have it pretty early on in the process, and so, yeah, it's hard to describe. It's hard to sort of like unpack that sort of like intuitive decision of deciding to title it that. I think it was something like I knew that I wanted there to be a sort of frank dealing with sexuality, especially in that first book. Mm-hmm. That's something that I just wanted to explore. That's something I'm interested in art and just in general, like just sort of keeping that included in the conversation about the human experience, where I think like because of the way our, especially American society works, like we don't talk about sexuality in a sort of like frank manner. So I wanted to do that, and so I wanted a title that would sort of perhaps announce that in a way, but in doing so, I also wanted to get at an idea of empathy or connection or something like that via the sort of corporeality of a sexual experience or something like that, or perhaps sexual desire or something like that, to kind of move through that into an actual human connection. Mm-hmm. I think that's what I'm trying to do with this project. I'll have a better perspective on it once it's done, but I think that's the idea that I was going for. Or just like, I think also sometimes like a title like that is sort of like a challenge to set for myself. Like, oh, can I under the banner of this title arrive at the things that I want to arrive at? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if it.
No,
yeah.
it does, and it's interesting because I could see the title embedded in the first part of Generous Bosom because mm-hmm. you tend to emphasize that with the character Cindy. Mm-hmm. And, Glenn is constantly, when he first meets her, looking down her shirt. And you give us shots of those. Also, in the first book, one of the first images we get is of a brassiere.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, emphasis on sexuality and I guess bosoms in particular aren't as apparent in the second and third volume. So that's why I was wondering, why you chose the title Generous Bosom. Now, along with that, I'm curious to know if you've come across readers or have heard of potential readers who may want to look at your work, but then they look at the title and they think that's not for me.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen it happen in front of me at like conventions and book fairs and stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something that I've thought a lot about. I've workshopped a lot of alternative titles. I'm certainly thinking about maybe changing the overall title if and when it's collected. But titles are hard things to shake. You know what I mean? Like it's once a thing is named something, it's hard to name it something different.
Right.
It's also like a really interesting, difficult, painful challenge to be working on a story that, in this case, I started, 6 years ago and made those kind of decisions 6 years ago. And would I title a book I'm working on now Generous Bosom? I don't think I would. But yeah, I'm sort of left with that challenge now, and I'm trying to work under those conditions. Yeah, I certainly don't want to alienate people, and I certainly understand why somebody who would encounter encounter it just like, on the cover of a book would not want to buy it. I also think there's like an interesting thing where it's like, I think especially they maybe don't want to like buy it directly from me at a festival or something. I think maybe people are more likely to buy a book that sort of like is hinting at that kind of content, like from a bookstore. Maybe I'm making that up, but I think, yeah, I mean, I also think that the title also, it announces, what you're getting, at least, especially with the first volume, when there is like a sort of extended sex scene in there, like that is maybe sort of, hinted at more, with the title, so that, someone wouldn't be necessarily blindsided by that, which I would want people to be entering into that sort of content, that sort of like area of exploration willingly, and not to feel like that was like sprung upon them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I know it's provocative in its way, but I do appreciate how it's, it describes a physical thing. And one of the things one of the aspects of your art in general that kind of strikes me is just how visceral and uneasy I feel in a lot of ways seeing things. And I don't mean it in a negative way. I just mean that first book is, you're very frank about their, the encounter between Glenn and Cindy, and, things get physical, but they're not romanticized in a lot of ways that sometimes those things end up being.
Yeah.
When you get a comic, like it's sex, but it's not sexy sex. It's kind of real weird sex, and not weird like kinky, just weird like awkward. Like, what do two people who, just that setup you talked about, like my bike broke down and I just ended up in this house, and there's this weird series of events that just leads to this thing happening. It's not going to be fun. It's going to be something strange, and kind of going through the series, the kinds of different horrific imagery, like in some of the later books, Cindy, is she pregnant? Is she not pregnant? Are things like that happening? I'm hoping I'm not tipping some things, but it's kind of horrible to kind of, to think about the violence done to a person where they're being manipulated, where they can't even trust what's going on in their own body kind of thing. I mean, it's, you got some very like deep seated horror going on here that I think is it rewards the reader to read it and kind of reread it to kind of get just how deep the story and the characters and the things that they're dealing with are. To me, like that is, one of the things I appreciated reading it. Like it kind of gets it. There's kind of this movement to separate the physical out by doing some kind of weird mental manipulation, but it's like they can't escape it, and it keeps creeping up. And when it does, it's like these just horrible eruptions of, I don't know, dread or violence. And like, I don't know. It's like I said, I found your book very unsettling, but very compelling.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. What did I want to say? I think, the idea of like a disjunction between how one is seeing the world and one's own body, I think, is like something that feels very like present in our culture currently. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to work that stuff out. Like what does it mean to have a body that has, you know, limitations and can be, you know, manipulated or yeah. How do we figure out what's even going on inside our own heads, let alone the world at large. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very contemporary in a lot of ways. I didn't expect it because it's a lot of the stuff that's kind of in the zeitgeist right now. Like, you know, what's happening with people's bodies, who controls things. And, you know, I did not expect that from this series. And I really appreciate you wrestling with them like this way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm trying to rise to that challenge. I hope that I can do justice to that kind of subject matter, because it is like super sensitive and yeah, I mean, all these issues, you know, I'm really like aware that there are some people that just like don't want to in the art that they consume, they don't want to necessarily be reminded of the sort of worst things available to us in the human experience. But I think that, you know, the same way that, like, you know, it's been shown that children like to, you know, they'll sort of like fold into their play the things that frighten them most, you know. I think that that's certainly something that I'm trying to do, kind of like find the things that are scariest about being alive right now and try to kind of somehow work through them. And I hope I'm trying to do that in a sensitive manner, and I would hope that no one would be you know, hurt or something, or disgusted or something. But I think that's something I think will be a real that's in my mind every day, sort of trying to stick the landing of this story. I think that's going to be a big challenge, or, you know, just to do justice to those issues while also telling a satisfying story, while also, you know, being true to these characters. Yeah, I mean, these are all the things I'm trying to do.
Hey, I think you're doing them well.
Yes, you
I mean,
are.
If you're going to be horrified, I think it's in the, it's not by the content, but it's by kind of the goings on and kind of, you know, the kind of realness of the violence that you're describing, more so than, I don't think, you know, like, I didn't read this and I was like, oh my God, I'm offended by what's you know, what Conor's drawing here. Like, I don't think your images are offensive in and of themselves. I think the story you're telling has like rightly offensive aspects to them, but they're supposed to be like,
right. Yeah.
If that makes sense. Or at least that's how I felt. I took it that way.
So is the best way for listeners to find out and get copies of Generous Bosom directly from your website?
Yeah, I mean, I currently don't have copies of the first issue. If people are looking to kind of get introduced to the series, I think maybe Breakdown still has copies, and I know that there's a couple, you know, fine comics retailers that do carry it. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I should have looked up who still has copies of the first one, because we reprinted it I think last year, but I think at least I'm out of my copies of the first one. I have copies of the second and third if people are needing to catch up on that.
So
But
they may want to check like a, you know, halfway decent comic shop, or they can go to breakdownpress.com to see what they have. And if they want to find not just, you know, copies of Generous Bosom, but also some of your other work that you have available both digitally and also in print form, they can go to your website, and that's ConorStechschulte.com, and that's one word, ConorStechschulte.com.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I have a lot of like sort of one-off sort of self-published stuff too that it's available that way.
Like Christmas in Prison?
Yes. Yeah.
A happy story.
Yes. Another uplifting story.
Hey.
Well, Conor, we want to thank you again for coming on the Comics Alternative, talking with us about not only Generous Bosom, but also other aspects of your work.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for taking the time to read and think about this stuff. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a thrill for me too. I wasn't really familiar with your work before, but I'm going to go to your website and buy some things soon.
Great.
Cool.
All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Wow, Derek, that was a great talk. That series, Generous Bosom, just really struck me as this really interesting thing right now. Just it seems to capitalize on a lot of the kind of horrors of modern life. And I don't know, it just really unsettled me, but in a good way.
Yeah, I agree. And, as we were discussing with Conor, the thing about this third volume that came out earlier this year, it takes the story in a different direction. I mean, I felt that the first two volumes, or the first two books, more or less followed one after the other in terms of the story. When we got to part 3, it's as if we take a sharp turn in a different direction, and in a good way, and it complicates things. And so we're wondering, okay, so what's going on? And so it introduces or it injects additional mysteries. And that is part of Stechschulte's style, and I really appreciate what he's doing here.
Yeah, I agree. I'm really glad to get to know his work, and I was really glad to get to talk to him and kind of get his take on everything. So I think this was a great interview. Yeah,
really nice guy, great narrative. He is a notable comics creator, and if our listeners aren't familiar with the work of Conor Stechschulte, they should definitely check him out.
I agree.
And if you want to find great books like Generous Bosom and The Amateurs especially, then check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there every month you're going to find some incredible specials. That's dcbservice.com.
Tell them the two guys sent you.
That's right. Send them an email. That helps us.
Helps everyone.
And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our conversation with Conor Stechschulte. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can email us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com, or you can just email me at sturge@comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. We're all over social media, so you can contact us that way. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on TuneIn, and on iHeartRadio. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
We are everywhere.
That's right. And in a good way, not in a creepy way.
That's right. Like a good big brother, not the creepy big brother.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah. Sturge and I will be back with more interviews later this month, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sturge.
Take care.
Peace.